Picture this for a second. You are standing at the absolute terrifying edge of human knowledge. For all of recorded history, the exact spark of conception, the very dawn of human life, was locked away. It was this dark, silent, completely untouchable mystery inside the womb. But what happens when human hands literally reach into that darkness, pull the genesis of life out, and put it under the harsh fluorescent lights of a laboratory? When exactly does a microscopic cluster of cells cross that invisible threshold and become a human being with real moral rights?
Well, the prospect of doing exactly that didn't just push the boundaries of science. It triggered an absolute existential panic across the globe. We're talking a shockwave. Just days before the world's first very successful test tube baby was actually born, Cardinal Albino Luciani, who, by the way, was about to become Pope John Paul I, issued this incredibly dire warning. He was terrified that this medical breakthrough would permanently sever the spiritual bond of marriage from reproduction. He warned of a dystopian future that could, in his words, reduce women to baby factories. So you have to understand, the stakes here weren't just medical anymore. To millions of people, this was a battle for the very soul of humanity.
The genesis of IVF, outcasts, miracles, and the invention of bioethics. In this explainer, we are going to dive deep into a fiercely opposed, deeply human scientific crusade that forced the entire world to redefine the limits of life itself. Act 1. Outcasts of Medical Science.
Okay, let's step back to the 1960s. Back then, infertility was this heavily stigmatized, terribly silent, and often shameful struggle. If you couldn't conceive naturally, mainstream medicine basically just offered you a closed door. The psychological toll this took on millions of people was devastating, but it was largely ignored by a scientific community that was completely obsessed with global population control, not population creation. Against this incredibly hostile backdrop, three complete outcasts brought their unique skills together to do the impossible. First, you have Robert Edwards. He's this brilliant, obsessive physiologist, the son of a miner. Then, Patrick Steptoe, a rugged World War II Navy survivor who was pioneering laparoscopic keyhole surgery while the rest of the medical establishment practically laughed at him. And crucially, Jean Purdy, a meticulously dedicated nurse who became the world's very first clinical embryologist. Without any one of these three individuals, in vitro fertilization just wouldn't exist.
And it wasn't some overnight success story. They endured an agonizing decade of continuous failure. I mean, they successfully fertilized an egg in a dish in 1969, sure, but then they faced years where the embryos just failed to implant. By 1974, the emotional and financial strain was so heavy that Robert Edwards actually fell into a deep depression. He even offered Jean Purdy the chance to just quit and join another project. It was her absolute, steadfast refusal to abandon the mission that kept the team alive when they were dangerously close to throwing in the towel entirely.
Because here is the crazy part. The British medical establishment didn't just ignore IVF, they actively tried to kill it. In 1971, the incredibly powerful Medical Research Council aggressively rejected their funding. Why? Well, the establishment was terrified. They feared grotesque birth defects, pointing to early animal studies that showed things like eye abnormalities in rats. They viewed Steptoe surgical methods as completely reckless. And, to be honest, Edwards had this habit of bypassing the medical journals and speaking directly to the media, which deeply alienated his peers. So this massive rejection essentially severed them from official, sanctioned science.
This forced our pioneers into a clinical Wild West. Imagine the vivid, everyday reality of Kershaw's Cottage Hospital in Oldham. We are not talking about some state-of-the-art facility here. It was a makeshift, underfunded laboratory tucked away in a small town. And they were kept afloat entirely by private philanthropy, most notably the secret funding of an American millionaire who had actually suffered from infertility herself. So inside this quiet little sanctuary, Jean Purdy is meticulously crafting the culture media needed to sustain fragile human life, while the outside world is either scoffing at them or actively plotting to shut them down.
Acts 2, the miracle and the panic.
Entering into the clinical trials, the tension was unbelievable. Every single decision made in that makeshift lab carried profound human consequences. These weren't just abstract experiments in a petri dish. They were working with desperate patients who had put all their hopes into a procedure that had literally never worked before. For years, they just couldn't get an embryo to successfully implant and grow in the room. Then they made this massive, completely counterintuitive realization. The heavy synthetic hormones they were pumping into these women to stimulate egg production, those drugs were actually ruining the uterine lining right before implantation. So the solution was radical? They had to abandon the drugs entirely and meticulously track the woman's natural cycle. They had to wait for the exact natural surge of luteinizing hormone, which meant operating at all hours of the day or night to surgically retrieve the egg at the perfect fleeting biological moment.
But before we get to the breakthrough, we really need to talk about the immense human stakes here. And no one embodies this more than a woman known in the medical literature only as Patient 38. Over nearly a decade, she bravely endured 10 experimental, failed attempts at IVF. Think about that psychology. 10 times she built up her hopes, underwent invasive surgery, and then faced absolutely crushing disappointment. While she never achieved a successful pregnancy herself, her immense courage gave Edwards, Steptoe, and Purdy the critical, hard-won knowledge they needed to eventually help millions of others.
And then, finally, the breakthrough. On July 25, 1978, Louise Joy Brown was born, and she was perfectly healthy. The press immediately dubbed her the baby of the century. The awe, the relief, the shared joy of actually curing infertility was overwhelming for families all around the world. Edwards, Steptoe, and Purdy had proven undeniably that human conception outside the human body was an absolute reality. A massive biological barrier had been permanently breached.
But as you can probably guess, this scientific triumph instantly collided with profound moral terror. We really have to look objectively at how this split the world right down the middle. On one side, you've got scientists and thousands of infertile couples celebrating a miraculous cure. But on the other side, institutions across Catholicism, Protestantism, and Islam experienced deep existential panic. To them, separating the physical act of love from the creation of life violated natural law. It violated the sanctity of the family. There was this very genuine, very real fear that scientists were now playing God, literally tampering with the sacred blueprint of humanity.
Act 3. The Reckoning.
So with the birth of Louise Brown, the British government suddenly wakes up to a shocking reality. IVF is happening right now, human embryos are actively being created and cultured in glass dishes, and there are absolutely zero ethical guidelines or laws governing any of it. None. They desperately needed to draw a moral line in the sand. Operating in what was essentially a clinical Wild West, the government formed an inquiry in 1982. But here's the fascinating part. Instead of letting scientists police themselves, they appointed a moral philosopher, Mary Warnock, to lead it. And for the first time, individuals from other professions, social workers, theologians, lawyers, actually outnumbered the doctors and scientists on the committee. The government recognized this wasn't just a science issue anymore, it was a profound societal issue, and the public conscience needed to take the reins. Now, Mary Warnock faced an absolute philosophical deadlock. She quickly realized that cold, hard science could not unite these fiercely incompatible moral sentiments. You had the utilitarian scientists shouting, "Look at the medical benefits, we can cure disease, we can create families," and then you had the opponents responding, "I don't care what the benefits are, I feel it to be fundamentally, morally wrong to experiment on human embryos." These are two entirely different languages of morality, and Warnock somehow had to find a middle ground and turn it into national law.
Her solution? Warnock proposed a genius act of what historians call ontological surgery. She created the 14-day rule. It dictated that an embryo could be researched on, but strictly only up to 14 days after fertilization. Now, why 14 days? Well, because biologically, that is roughly when the primitive streak forms. That's the very first precursor to a nervous system, the hint of sentience. And it's also the point past which an embryo can no longer split into twins, so individuation has occurred. It was a brilliant pragmatic compromise. It allowed vital scientific progress to continue while legally honoring the special, unique moral status of the developing embryo.
To make this legally palatable, society had to adapt its language. The entirely novel category of the pre-embryo was conceptualized just for those first 14 days. And following Warnock's recommendations, the UK government established the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, or the HFEA. This was a monumental global first, a dedicated government regulatory body designed strictly to monitor, license, and regulate the very creation and handling of human life in a laboratory. Official, formalized bioethics had officially arrived.
When we trace this historical arc, it is just an incredible journey. In just over a decade, Edwards, Steptoe, and Purdy went from being isolated, unfunded outcasts hiding out in Oldham to opening Bourne Hall in 1980, which was the world's very first dedicated IVF clinic. By 1984, the Warnock Report was published, and by 1990, the 14-day rule was enshrined into UK law, literally setting a global precedent. 3 individuals, driven by intense compassion and sheer scientific obsession, didn't just cure a medical condition. They permanently reshaped modern bioethics and the very definition of the human family. But of course, history is never truly settled, is it? Today, as we stand on the precipice of unbelievable new frontiers, gene editing, artificial wombs, embryos created entirely from stem cells without an egg or sperm, we have to ask a profound question. Will the fragile, pragmatic, moral lines drawn by Mary Warnock over 40 years ago actually hold? Or are we, right now, on the verge of a terrifying yet thrilling new bioethical reckoning? The tools and the technology have definitely changed, but that ultimate mystery, where exactly we draw the line on human life, remains just as powerful today as it was in that makeshift little lab in Oldham.